There are times that history is painful. There are subjects in the social sciences that are complex and intricate. But this book really delves into the need for such topics to be discussed and techniques and strategies on how to do so. So really that idea of how do we encourage reflective democracy? So when we look at the chapters, we see themes. Lots of the chapters and authors really focus on this idea of how do we examine and reimagine educational spaces. So just because we've always done something a certain way doesn't mean we need to continue doing it that way. So how as educators and teacher educators can we examine what's happening and then also reimagine those educational spaces? How do we counter disparities in access and opportunities? How do we challenge these systems that perpetuate injustice and inequities? This idea of examining multiple perspectives, and critical race theory also really points out the importance of including counter stories. So ensuring that we have counter stories, stories of people who have been historically placed on the margins, ensuring that these are represented in our schools, encouraging critical literacy, and promoting justice-oriented citizenship and advocacy. So as we move throughout our breakouts this evening, you will see connections to many of these themes in relation to fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion. And a lot of the work that Greg and I do in relation to professional development, we frame our ideas around these 4 V's. How do we ensure in our schools and in our curriculum that diversity, that diverse students, diverse representations are visible, that they are voiced, that they are valued, and that they are validated? And again, as we move throughout our sessions this evening, we will hear a lot of great ideas on how in higher educational contexts, elementary context, and secondary context, we can work to ensure that students in our schools and our sociocultural context can be embraced in relation to these 4 V's as well as in our curriculum. So our agenda throughout this evening, we're about to break out into our first session. So in our first session, we have 2 options. You will choose one of those 2 to attend. Each session is 15 minutes in presentation time, but there will be also transition time. Then we will come back into the main group, and then we will disperse into session 2, and then session 3, and then we will have a Q&A and then final comments to wrap up our evening. So we'll be together for about an hour and a half. So our first session, we have room 1, which is Lessons Ignored, Teaching the Conclusions and Failures of the Chicago Commission on Race Relations. And then we have room 2, Stepping Out of the Ivory Tower, an Anti-Racist University Community Partnership. So Dean, would you like to give the directions on how to transition into the breakouts?
Sure. All the breakout rooms for all 3 sessions have already been created. So you'll see in the breakout room options, you have session 1, room 1, or session 1, room 2. And you should be able to, if your Zoom is updated, be able to select which room you would like to go to. If it's not, then I'll be able to put you in a room once we have everybody in the rooms. So again, you'll be able to select your room, session 1, room 1, or session 1, room 2. And they should be open.
Dr. Kevin McGowan and I want to welcome you. We'll talk a little bit about our chapter. Our chapter is titled Stepping Out of the Ivory Tower, an Anti-Racist University Community Partnership. As you assume, obviously, I'm Dr. Melissa Winchell, and Kevin and I teach here at Bridgewater State University in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, just south of Boston. We're both faculty in the College of Education and Health Sciences. So we're going to start with a little bit of an introduction for you, just to give you a sense of how our partnership began and got underway. Kevin, when you're ready, if you could go to the click present and then, yeah, go to the next slide.
Would you all like a 3 or 5 minute warning?
Sure, that'd be great.
Or 2?
So, I don't know what's going on with my present.
I think if you just click the present button, we can see your screen already, Kevin. So just go to the right a little bit and click the regular present button.
Right.
Yeah, there you go. Awesome. And can you go to the next slide, do you mind? Thank you so much. You think after all the Zoom time we've all had, right? I think it's getting so old now that we're all forgetting what to do. All right, so we want to talk to you a little bit about the Community University Partnership and provide you some background. So a Black parent residing in our university's predominantly white town reached out to our university concerned about the use of the N-word and other racially charged incidents at her children's public intermediate school. The school houses grades 4, 5, and 6. According to the parent, the school lacked both anti-racist curriculum and professional development around equity. The concerned Black parent wanted to know if the university had resources to offer training for students, faculty, and staff. The parent was connected to the director of our university's Institute for Social Justice. That director reached out to Kevin and to me. And as I said, we're 2 professors in the Education College, and we have decades of experience in anti-racist education. We were invited by the parent to attend monthly planning meetings that included other parents of color, white parents of biracial children, and members from a local grassroots social justice group. The Black parent who began the partnership led the meetings, setting goals for the end of the first year. One of her goals included an anti-bias assembly for the intermediate school where her children were enrolled. During monthly planning meetings, members provided important background information regarding the school district in general and the intermediate school in particular. They warned us that the school and the district had been historically impotent with their cultural responsiveness by agreeing in word that such education was necessary, but not actually ever committing to action. So given these warnings, our partnership proceeded with an invitational strategy as the anti-racist university and community partners attempted to win over the intermediate principal through an appeal to become a leader in social justice education. These appeals did result in an anti-bias assembly for all students at that intermediate school. You can see the photo there in the bottom left corner of your screen. So Kevin and I planned the assembly, inviting feedback via multiple meetings with parents, community partners, and the principal. We led the assembly together in early June 2019. The partnership defined objectives for the intermediate students, which included identifying similarities and differences within their groups of peers with appropriate language, defining bias, identifying instances of unfair treatment of their classmates due to bias, and developing a classroom plan of how to confront bias and stand up for fairness at school. While the assembly was lauded by members of the community partnership, the response of the school was less than enthusiastic. In meetings following the assembly, it became increasingly clear that the values of the community and university were at odds with the values of most of the school district's leadership, and even some of the school's white middle-class parents. These parents had complained that the assembly had been an unnecessary foray into racial issues that were not, so they said, a part of evidenced in their school community, nor a part of it. So Kevin, next slide, please. Despite these and some other conflicts, the community partnership continued and grew, moving at times from an invitational approach to more strategic, political, and confrontational approaches. In fact, the partnership is in its 3rd school year and has extended its reach to multiple schools in the district, the town school board, and the superintendents. Our university has provided research expertise, leadership in district meetings, a meeting site, and funding for its first forum on racial justice, and partnerships with key stakeholders. In addition, the partnership continues to set and achieve new goals, including the expansion of work into parent-teacher organizations, new administrator advocates in the district, and a new school board subcommittee on anti-racism. The parents and community members have, in fact, organized themselves into a nonprofit with an active working board of directors and an increasing social media reach in the community. Next slide. So Kevin and I are participants, as you can tell, in this partnership, and we decided also to research it as we've been experiencing it. So the purpose of our study as both participants and researchers is to explore the effects of the partnership with which we're involved, and to think about those effects in terms of parents, community members, and faculty as well. Our research question on the next slide, please, is how does a university community partnership in a predominantly white suburban public school district disrupt white colorblind school practices and develop anti-racist education in P-12 schools? And I'm going to pass off now to Kevin.
Thank you, Melissa. So I will talk a bit here about the community university partnerships in terms of connection to the literature and our theoretical frameworks. So of course, looking at family and community involvement, literature is well documented that family involvement has positive benefits for children. However, the BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, people of color families in our study here, described schools as racist and also identified structural barriers to BIPOC family and community engagement with schools. Parents noted numerous microaggressions, and it became clear that their input was not welcome in certain schools. There is a significant gap in the literature related to community university partnerships around promoting anti-racism in school districts. So we looked at cultural humility, colorblindness, and critical consciousness. So those were our theoretical constructs. And in a nutshell, cultural humility is the ability to understand and look at another person's culture while at the same time really taking a critical look at your own positionality within that culture. So you're not coming to the culture as an outside expert. You're acknowledging that that person is the expert in their lived experience relationship with their own culture. We also unpacked this construct or this term of colorblindness a bit and looked at it in terms of how the participants in the study were defining it. And they looked at colorblindness in terms of it just being not seeing who they really are. You're using this broad Eurocentric term to kind of whitewash and paint it and make everyone be the same as the dominant color, which is white. Then finally, critical consciousness. So a Freirean concept here, and it has three tenets here, which are connected to self-reflection. And I have my notes here, so I don't want to forget them. Yeah, so here we have critical consciousness, reflection, so the ability to identify systemic inequities, efficacy, the belief that a person or a community can take action to right those systems, and then action, the individual or community work to transform systems. So this is our research design. So it was a qualitative case study. We have our participants here that you can see from the screen here. So 7 parents, 3 Black, 1 Asian, 3 white, the 2 professors here, as Melissa noted earlier, included us, data analysis and the data sources there. So results of the study. So 5 broad themes here. So racist incidents. So BIPOC families' experiences of schools as racist. So outlining incidents such as the parent who initiated this study, problems with her son and the N-word being thrown around in the school. Whitewashed curriculum segregated and misrepresentative. So it just focused on this white-centric, Eurocentric model based on this colorblind notion. Anti-racism for all. So the need for white students to come to terms with a racialized society, and this is kind of looking at this interest conversion. So discussing and really focusing on the fact that anti-racist education benefits white students as well as BIPOC students. So colorblind school district leadership, racial neutrality and evasiveness of school district. So for example, we did surveys at the school system's request. Data came back identifying some of these incidences related to these other terms we have here, for example, the whitewashed curriculum. And the school district leadership said that they needed more data. So every time we would go back to them with the more data, that was always, we need more data. Then finally, invitational appeal here. So going from the space of being invited to the table and kind of tiptoeing around the white leaders to learning how to be politically savvy. So identifying folks at the state level who are focused on anti-racist initiatives. In turn, because the school district administrators report to the state folks. So if it comes down from state people, then they're more likely to implement it. And finally, being able to be confrontational based on your political savviness. So then you're able to confront the school district leaders and say, this is something that is a state mandate, and your school and your school district is also mandated to follow through. So implications for practice. So commit to critical friendship. So that is the critical friendship that we developed with and between the members of the study. Critical friendship involved calling people into this work and in certain instances, calling people out in the work. Just talked a bit about exercising political savviness, and then finally having to come to terms with navigating the sensitivities of the white fragility of district leadership and how to use that to try to move the anti-racist agenda forward. And here's our contact information, and we'll end there.
I was trying to find my emojis. Round of applause. Well done. Very informative. So I love how, I know this isn't the Q&A session, but I love how you all engage the family and community. I also thought it was especially important that you all focused on the language and political savviness. And I also especially loved how you all chose the conceptual framework. Very much on point. Thank you all.
Thank you for having us. Thanks for coming all.
Yes, thank you all for joining us. We look forward to the question and answer session.
And you all do great work up there at Bridgewater State University with your DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion. A little bit of Chief Diversity Officer program work going on. And
Yep, so absolutely. Yeah, Melissa and I do quite a bit of social justice and anti-racist work here at the university and in the surrounding community.
I was going to say, and additionally, you bring partners to the school and you all engage in different activities to try to connect and close the circle between your university, community members, and stakeholders and partners.
Well, welcome to our little breakout room about our chapter, where we really, this chapter kind of was born out of work and conversations that Sarah and I have had about conversations with our social studies student teachers and about how they were engaging with space, particularly around the creation of a map of white supremacy on our building, particularly pointing to the legacy of names and buildings. And it really drove it home for me when students were talking about their direct relationship to these buildings on a very personal level without having engaged the history. Because a lot of these buildings are buildings where classes is, they're also dorms, so some of these students had lived there. And I connected to it very personally because I too lived in a building named for a white supremacist, John C. Calhoun. And we were really not allowed to escape that fact from the get-go. You know, his portrait hangs at the end of our, at one end of our dining hall, and he's a very, you can't miss him. He's a very distinctive man. If you've ever seen a picture of John C. Calhoun, he kind of looks either about how you would imagine or how you wouldn't imagine. There's no kind of in between on good old John C. There were depictions of South Carolina at his time in the window, stained glass windows, so that meant depictions of enslaved people. So we weren't really allowed to escape the fact that we were living in a room in a building named for a white supremacist and someone who had historic ties to the college. And we, you know, my roommates and I would talk about this, and so it took me aback that students would be like, oh, I had no idea about the person who's building, you know, the name I lived in, and I had no idea about their history, because it feels like some of us, that's a very pertinent issue. So that conversation sparked conversations between me and Sarah, and it led to the chapter that Matt already said was good, so I can't do my usual move of making fun of myself. So I'll just say it was good, and we'll move on from there. But that also led us to here, and I'll let Sarah take it over.
Yes, so as we were thinking about different spatial theories and critical spatial analysis, we kept talking about the fact that, you know, spaces are socially constructed, and they maintain power imbalances all the time, but they're always being reconstructed, and there's always this space for power imbalance to be disrupted. And so we really see that over the past few years in Richmond, right? That's a great example of the Robert E. Lee statue, of how that was part of many people, particularly white people's passive imagination as they walk through this space all the time. But then it started being recreated, reconstructed, reclaimed in different ways. And you kind of see that here in the middle. And then on the right, you see it being removed recently, right? And so that space has been remade to be more equitable than it was. So I think we can kind of, as we look at that as an example, can help us think about some different critical spatial theories that were really undergirding the chapter that we wrote.
So that led us to wanting our own students, and then thinking about them as teachers, to want to be able to address those power dynamics in their classroom and give them the tools, because maps and space are, of course, they're processes made by people. We bring a lot to that. We add our imagination, we add our biases, we add our perceptions of power. And if we don't give our student teachers and their students the tools to look at that and start to look at the undergirdings of those powers, then they're just gonna sort of let some of these, you know, assumptions and ideas kind of passively float through their space. I like this juxtaposition. These are both maps of the Pacific Ocean, one that we're far more familiar with because it very much attaches to our assumptions about how space should be represented, about how what matters in representation. That's the bottom one. The top one, the teacher may want to ask us if anyone knows, but I won't, since we don't have much time, I won't do that. But the top one is actually produced by wave piloters from the Marshall Islands, and it's also a map of the Pacific Ocean that helps them get around from island to island as they sail across. And once again, there's a whole different set of assumptions and knowledges and expertises that they're using to build that. And we don't want to, what we want our students to be able to do is to piece apart the assumptions of the space that they're going into. So we want to give them the tools to look at the critical spatiality of it and give them the theories, parts of the theories that are going into it. So give them like the useful nuggets from Said and Smith and Soja Lefebvre and many others who have talked about space. We're by far not the first people to talk about this. And we want to recognize that we are building off their ideas as we bring it into our own classroom. What we're doing is adding a social studies education twinge on it so that they can take it into their classrooms and then do that work with their students. And so we call on these ideas to help to pull out these assumptions.
So obviously we wanted to see how education scholars have used these theories in research with K-12 students and also with pre-service teachers. And there are definitely more examples than what I have up here, but I'm going to highlight two. One with K-12, both of the studies that are up here are about students mapping a school or their community. And the second one that's listed was within an after-school program, and students were analyzing existing maps of their community. And then with GIS technology, they created new maps where they overlaid images and audio recordings to counter those narratives told about their community with the existing maps. And also to kind of dream about what it would look like to remake some of this space within their community. With some of the scholarship with pre-service teachers was one, just introducing kind of spatial analysis to pre-service teachers in general and seeing how that impacted the way that they would teach. But another study by Strauss that I thought was really interesting was she was teaching a study on kind of an intersectional lens of race, gender, and class, looking at Dr. J. Marion Sims and the field of gynecology. And there was a prominent statue in New York City of Sims. The top of it was taken off, but the pedestal remains. And so the project within this class was to create an art installation that could be a counter monument that sat on top of the pedestal, really speaking back to the ways in which Sims was being honored before. And so these are just a few examples of how education scholars have used these theories with students. One, to help students critically analyze a space, but two, to also provide opportunities for students to remake spaces or to think about remaking spaces.
So this this led us to thinking about the ways in which imagination guides our thinking about space, both passively and actively. And I'll talk about the passive, and Sarah will talk about the active. And I've given you an example of the passive, which was the students not knowing the legacy of the names and kind of silently walking by these buildings, letting these ideas remain in the environment. We've got an interesting conversation going on campus right now. The building in this picture right here is Wallace Hall, named for George Wallace, the famous segregationist governor. And there's a conversation about what's the future of this hall's name? Do we change it? Do we not? Our board has kind of put on this plaque in front of it. But the idea about passive imagination is that these ideas are floating around in our space and they're impacting us in some ways, like letting us walk by Wallace Hall or other halls named for other people, and not really calling us to question, why is this name here? Why is this legacy here? Why are we just allowing this legacy to kind of lay flat on our space, dictating what's going on and what's occurring? In my own example I gave before about my dorm named for John C. Calhoun, there were kind of flare-ups where we would talk about changing it and then they would die down. And in those die down moments, that once again, like John C. Calhoun gets to kind of live in our passive imagination. As a spoiler alert, it's no longer John C. Calhoun. It's now named for Grace Hopper, which I think is a great change, but we won't talk about that anymore. But that passive imagination is like where those ideas kind of seep in, and I kind of think about it as a seep in, like they're just sort of layering and lying dormant as we're walking by and moving through. And then Sarah will talk about active imagination.
And so we really hope that for ourselves and also for our students, that we and they begin to have active imaginations within the spaces that they move. And so one example of active imagination that took place in an elementary methods course that I teach is that not in the past year during COVID, but before, we every semester would go to visit the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is the memorial that remembers people that were lynched from Reconstruction to 1950. And so one thing that the students do in this space is filled with pillars or columns for each county where there is a documented lynching. And so students would go and find their home county and write down the names of people who were lynched in their county. And they would do other reflective work on the field trip. But a way that this speaks to active imagination is obviously it has students begin to question the ways in which they think about their hometowns. So for example, one student came and talked to me a few days after this, and she said, I never knew this history. Some of these lynchings happened when my grandparents were alive, and I've never heard of this. She went back and researched the men whose names she had written down. And this active imagination just provides an opening to disrupt the discourse that many of the pre-service teachers had of their hometowns, and making room for them to break down this, who they were seeing as us and who they were seeing as other within their hometown in that space. And so we really wanted this chapter not to be one that was like a practitioner piece necessarily, but we wanted us to think about, as social studies teacher educators, what does it look like for us to help to facilitate these moments of learning, of helping students really be pushed from a passive imagination in spaces to more active ones.
Which leads us to our next sort of central and grounding moment, which was moments of learning, where these disruptions lead to reconceptualizations of time and space. And I thought about this for my own students when we were touring a local plantation cottage on our campus that our college actually owns, our university owns, and operates as a center for humanities. And one thing that they had done recently in the past couple of years was that they had removed the portraits of the people who had lived there, and they had actually put up portraits of the Native American leaders who lived there before the removal of the Native American nations, the indigenous nations of the region. And what that caused as we started to talk about it and think about it was that it gave us a moment of learning where we were able to sit in this disruption and start to piece together a lot of different histories, because the history of Indian removal is well known and well documented through everything about the Trail of Tears in this region. But what wasn't known was the names and the people that were associated with us. So the students and I were kind of going through this transition of disruption from understanding this history and understanding the violence of this history to now attaching names and faces with it. And that elevated it to a different part of our imagination and thinking about this space, because now it was no longer just this tragic story. It was now there were faces and things that we could attach to, people we could attach to it with names and their own lives, and that we had been able to access. So it changed very much. Oh gosh, that went fast. That went through with that. And then Sarah will quickly talk about reflection. I'm sorry.
And I'll just say that in the chapter, hopefully you will get the book, but we just posed some reflection questions to think about what does this mean for us personally, and what does this mean for us as social studies teacher educators and the ways that we plan our courses and develop those. Yeah.
Thank y'all so much for coming.
So I will begin. All right. Hi, everyone. I am Tony Rochester, and I'm going to be presenting on behalf of myself and Dr. Tina Hefner. She's unable to be here, and we represent the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And our book chapter was on policy standards textbooks and the role in teaching and learning African American history. So some background on our study is state legislatures create the policies that govern the curriculum and direct K-12 instructions. So what is assumed is that the policy decision that's adopted is explicitly aligned with the state standards, and that they endorse the state curriculum resources that the policy defines. What is the official curriculum? Some states exercise greater control over the curriculum by identifying state textbooks, versus other ones give a list of state textbooks that states can then look at. So Dr. Hefner and I, we were interested in looking at how the state policy is then in alignment with the state social studies standards, and then how does that alignment go with the state selected textbook or the adopted textbook. And we are looking at to study how African American history is represented within the official curriculum. So the focus of our study was on the intersectionality of anti-Blackness ideologies and the racialization of education. Through that, we formulated 3 research questions. The first one is, how is African American history presented in official state policy that's mandated in the state standards and the state adopted textbook? The second one is, how is African American history portrayed in official state curriculum? And the last one is, to what extent is the depiction of African American history representative of anti-Blackness education theory? So anti-Blackness education theory is a hybrid theory that is developed to examine the use of language in describing the experiences of African American standards and in the state adopted textbook, using tenets and attributes of CRT, critical race theory, and Black critical theory, or Black crit. So first, looking at standards and textbooks. So students may be exposed to very general and similar topics, concepts, but the depth of knowledge is going to vary from state to state. So states are seeking more standardizing approaches to the curriculum. State identifies grade levels that emphasize state history while incorporating national standards to develop textbooks with specific purposes. So within education, the textbooks are used as a method of teaching and supporting classroom instructions. But within that, textbooks selection process is known as a power struggle over knowledge and construction. So how does this align with African American history and K-12 curriculum? So Paul Ortiz in 2018 states, as other racial minorities grow, it becomes increasingly important to address the fundamental questions of the fairness for African Americans, which affects the fortitude of other groups. So the dominant narratives of American history are whitewashed. Whitewash focuses on the glorifying and only showcasing the success of primarily European or European Americans while demonizing Black people. So it can be argued that history curricula is separated into 2 categories, silence and whiteness. Silence is an ideology that is constructed and informed by power, and whiteness is defined as the presence and overarching dominance of white skins within the social construction, and normalizing this in numerous social contexts. Therefore, African-American students rarely see themselves within their curriculum, and thus that leads to big curricular disenfranchisement for African-American students, which causes a racial disconnect, misinformation, lack of interest, and then they tend to have a low achievement in history courses. So now looking at social studies textbooks and how that aligns with African-American history. So as stated before, there's limited regulations put on the social studies textbooks development, which allows states to freely adopt their own textbooks. Again, African-American history is typically taught when it benefits or in conjunction of the larger narratives of American history. Losky 2017 indicated that African-American history is typically taught in about like 4 timeframes. The first is the mid-19th century, which is the slavery and anti-literacy laws, the Reconstruction era, post-Brown versus Board of Ed, or today within the 20th century. There was a survey done on 19 textbooks by Woodson 2015 that found that the information within textbooks are misleading, especially regarding African Americans. Furthermore, that there would be a redundant portrayal of civil rights movement leaders or oversimplified depiction of said leaders. And it's always taught more in the past tense. There's no alignment between present day conditions, contemporary issues, racism, and or discrimination. And frequently that there will be this illusion of inclusion. So illusion of inclusion means that it may appear that the standards and language is integrated and that it's within the curriculum and textbooks, but there is a big racialized policy gap frequently. So within our study, we did a qualitative single case study, and it was an exploratory study on African-American history as is represented within the official curriculum. So I'm going to kind of give a quick outline of our study. So first, we identified states that explicitly included African Americans in their standards, along with resources such as textbooks, supplementary material. Next, we quantified the language to create a scale of explicit exclusion within the standards. Following that, we did an exploratory study of all 50 states, including Washington, D.C., to determine which of the 50 states and D.C. had official legislation that regarded the incorporation of African American history in school curriculum. We found that only 13 states had legislation requiring the inclusion of African American history, starting from various years, going back from 1984 as of late of 2017. Based on this, we decided to narrow our scope of research to middle school and selected 8th grade because that's frequently where standards are high for inclusion. We then developed a crosswalk of the standards aligned with the state policy legislation that required the teaching of African American history along with the state adopted textbook. From that, we identified South Carolina as a state that met all the criteria. And then we mapped out a standard selection that aligned with the topical content of the state textbook. And then we were intentional in selecting illustrations, which was in another chapter that we're developing, and then looking for parts of excerpts of the text that would align with the standards that we were looking at. So as I had stated before, we did a hybrid theory, anti-Blackness education theory, which takes components of CRT and Black critical theory. I'm not going to go through all the components of CRT, but we used all 5 tenets of CRT about white supremacy being property, the notion of colorblindness, the deconstruction of racism, and the destruction of racism only done through an interdisciplinary approach and incorporation of the social justice. And then within Black crit, we took the tenets, all 3 of its tenets or its purposes of anti-Blackness is an endemic, Blackness and disintention of neoliberalism, and Black crit creates a space for Black liberatory fantasy. So based on those tenets that we created, anti-Blackness, we identified themes that would use to talk about the tone and manner in which we believe represented African-American history experiences within the textbooks. And we developed that into 4 categories. The first one was oppression, which describes the portrayal of African-Americans in a subservient or dehumanizing tone. The next was statehood and identity, which we found very prevalent within South Carolina's textbook, and referred to the state being represented as an autonomous enemy, and that the goals of the state was embedded within whiteness and white power. The third was power struggle and resistance. So that refers to white resistance and its inclusion of African Americans within the state without explicitly talking about the racialization of it. The missed opportunities to talk about the inclusion of African American history and that perspective or counter narratives that's frequently seen within CRT or encouraged. And the dismissal of civic and civil engagement of African Americans. And the last one was omission. So that was the lack of knowledge, acknowledgement of contributions of African Americans, limited discussion about Supreme Court cases, and just missed opportunities that where African American history could be discussed. So this is the state legislation policy that was passed in 1984 within South Carolina. So some main points to take out of it was that it says that they must instruct students in the history of Black people as a regular part of the history and social studies courses. The regulation for adoption of history and social studies textbook, which incorporates Black history, so requiring that it must be within their state adopted textbook, and to assist school districts in developing and locating supplemental printed material and aids instructions in Black history. So ensuring that students and schools have the right material to support classroom instruction. So starting with standard 8.2 CC. So this one was to analyze the continuous change of how different groups migrated to South Carolina. And then we aligned that with experts of the text. So this was an expert from there. And the themes that we found within this expert was oppression and omission, which refers back to what I had seen on slide number 9. The next standard we did was 8.3 C0, which is compared the debates between South Carolina and the federal government regarding slavery and federalism. And then we see that within this standard, like slavery is described as an economic way of life. So we identify that that aligns with the statehood and identity component. The next one was standard 8.3E, which utilizing primary sources to analyze multiple perspectives of the effects of the Civil War in South Carolina. So we had found an excerpt where they talk about the 54th Infantry in Massachusetts, which was an all Black infantry. So we lined that with the topic of power struggle and resistance. One thing that we noticed within it that we thought was very interesting that they emphasized Colonel Shaw as being a young white officer. And then another standard that we had looked at was standard 8.4 CX, which evaluates South Carolina's struggle to create an understanding of post-Civil War position within the state and the country. And they were supposed to be talking about the different classes and specifically talking about African Americans. So within this excerpt that we found is where South Carolina talks about how many Black officials were holding in office post-Reconstruction. So we aligned that with the theme of statehood and identity because it was very much emphasizing about South Carolina identity and putting in pride in that South Carolina had the largest numbers of officer holders. But then it also aligned with this other theme of power struggle and resistance. And then our final theme that we looked at was 8.4 CC, which analyzes the continuous and change of African Americans' experience in the period of Reconstruction and of Jim Crow. So this is following the Jim Crow era. And within this excerpt is talking about how African Americans were still experiencing violence and then knowing how to refer to whites even post-Reconstruction. And we aligned that with the themes of power struggle and resistance, oppression and omission. So this is we did a final walk of where we had looked at the policy itself and the state textbook and then approved materials and the standards. So what I don't have in this PowerPoint is that we also look at supplementary materials that were within the standards and that were used to support classroom instruction, and that we also did some data analysis within that. And we still saw reoccurring themes of oppression being deemed as subservient. So for the policy, a critique that we had was that even though it's deemed forward thinking, in its implementation, it still falls short of being racially inclusive. Within the standards itself, in order to create citizenship and shift misguided perceptions about African Americans, the standards need to require students to learn about the experience and history of African Americans, and that this knowledge is directed to an example of social justice, as well as teachers and students in various ways of resisting oppression to promote equity for African Americans. And then looking at the adopted textbook for 8th grade students and the approved resources that I was just previously discussing, that the state adopted textbook and the resources guiding recommending history events from a colorblind perspective, and that the ills of the history should not be dwelled on, and that we should move forward and move past it within society. However, students, if they accurately learn about African American history, the textbooks must create a space to revisit history from the lens and perspective of African Americans and fellow people of color, which can be uncomfortable, but it's necessary when discussing history. So the concluding points of it were that there is a significant gap in state official policy, the state mandate standards, and the adopted curriculum in depicting oppressive narratives for African American history. Less than 1/3 of the references of African American history in the curriculum provided an expectation of a positive and assertive oriented history. African Americans and their history is not constructed in a manner that depicts inclusion or agency. So the subservient undertone that was aimed to show progress under democracy promotes students from within the official curriculum, of this normative experience that African Americans were just not barely skating by the skin of their teeth, but that they weren't as proactive or that they are deemed less than. And then one of the biggest concluding points that we saw was there was a misalignment between how the state social studies standards and the state policy guides the state adopted textbook, which prevents evidence that requiring educational leaders to thoughtfully examine the purpose and the aim of the official curriculum. Because just the policy itself mandating inclusion, if the textbook, which is the main resource for classroom instruction, does not show that, how then is there an alignment between the policy and the standard itself? And that is it. Thank you so much, everyone. If there are any questions, I'm free to answer it, or I don't know if we wait till the ending.
Great job, Tony. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And we can maybe give her a round of applause. Really great job. If anybody has any questions, we have about 2 minutes before we're going to be kicked out of this room.
Tony, I'm just curious about your perspective on recent legislation that we're seeing in a lot of schools and districts across the country. Do you think this will have additional impact on what you researched in a positive way, a negative way? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'm actually writing my dissertation on the 1619 project. So it's very interesting. I have a sibling that identifies as a conservative. And so even within those spaces, like when we're having discussions on it, I try to be objective, but I am very curious to see where we are going to move forward as a country. I don't think the conservative direction is the direction we should be going, but I could be biased. But from even just doing this work of just looking at the state textbooks, I realize just how intentional there has to be within inclusion and understanding what type of representation that we are expecting when we're talking about including counter narratives.
Thank you. And good luck with your dissertation.
Did you also find much differing attention by gender and also attention to Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, we did see a big difference in gender, especially when we were looking at the images. We did see that. And then with Indigenous, we didn't really focus on that. But then even in the intertwining of different groups, historically marginalized groups within the standards, we did see that there was a big misconnect when talking about state history.
As a conversation around some work that has been really personal, near and dear to us as researchers, and really this idea of the search. I guess you can go to the next slide. So we're going to start tonight really talking about this idea of citizenship. So this is a quote from Sister Citizen by Melissa Harris Perry that really talks about citizenship more than just being an individual exchange of freedoms. And when I read this as a researcher, it made me think about this idea of being seen and what ways through my own K-12 experience, and even as a public school practitioner and then a university practitioner, did I see myself in what was taught and understood in our classrooms. So I'll give you a second to kind of look at the quote.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think the rooms got mixed up. I'm supposed to
be okay.
one, but welcome, Candace, Gretchen. You all are up to present. So would you all just like to present in this session instead, unless something comes up?
Yeah, we can. We just kind of like, we thought we were a place where we're supposed to go, and we kind of roll with it.
Yeah, so we'll just roll with it. Thank you all for putting forth such great work. It's nice to put a face with a name. And I'm kind of getting kind of homesick coming from where you all are coming from, Morgan State. I was at Randallstown, as you all remember, when I first started out my career as a social
I taught at
studies teacher.
Randallstown High School.
Okay,
I did.
all right.
One of my original teaching assignments.
Nice. So I missed that place. And my wife, Amy, she was at Poly. She was at Poly.
Okay.
Those were our first 2 years of teaching as social studies teachers.
Oh,
So
wonderful.
we're so glad you all put forth this work, and we hope to engage with you all in the near future.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Greg. Do we need to stay here or we need to move? I feel
guess we
bad to
do.
take over your room.
Let me.
Don't want to
so-
take over your room.
Dean, are we okay in this session?
You can stay there if you want, but some other people are waiting for people to join their session yet.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
So we'll go
actually
wherever
fine.
you take
But
us.
Wherever you tell us, we'll go.
Oh, no, stay and talk, not a problem.
Okay.
All
I
right, so
did
we have this
go ahead
session.
and
We'll
start
go ahead.
recording this one, so it is being recorded in this session. So
Okay.
if you would like me to go to the other room and record that one, though, I'm fine to do that too. So just let me know.
All right, so I'll switch.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are we switching?
Hold on.
You tell us.
You tell us what you want us to do. Look,
We
of
can
course,
easily
we're like
move.
wherever you want us
Hold on
to
one
be.
second. Session 3, room 1.
Okay.
We'll go to session 3, room 1.
Okay, so should I
We
queue
are
up? Our...
staying. Guess we're staying, G.
Okay, let me just queue us up. Okay, here we
All
go.
right, let's go back.
All right.
So before our commercial break, we were kind of talking about this idea of citizenship and the ways that I know for me as a Black woman through my K-12 experiences, teaching on the college level, as well as in the public school systems. I taught in DC public schools as well as Baltimore County public schools. This idea of citizenship was kind of void of my presence and my likeness. So it kind of sparked my perspective as a researcher to find out more in the ways that we're searching for founding Black mothers. So that's kind of what got us there. So when we look in history and think about the contributions of Black women in the founding of the nation, very rarely do we see words like infiltrators, negotiators, protectors, evaders, escapologists, daily disruptors, strategists, spies, military operatives, advocates, recruiters, and informants in the American story of freedom. So when we began this search through the archives, it was fundamentally clear that the Black female experience in the story of the birth of the nation, as well as democracy, was void of descriptions of Black women in this way, but the archives were riddled with explanations of the ways in which they had contributed to democracy in these ways. So these words weren't associated with them, but as we started digging into the archives, this is all we found. G, do you have anything else? I think.
No, I think actually the search became a thing, right? So it became a thing for us, and it became something we did together. It also became something we did individually. So we ended up italicizing it for the chapter because it just felt like the search itself was a concept that could be applied to other spaces, other kind of roles that Black women took in history. So the search was personal, and we found out so much during the search about ourselves. And I think framing the search as a concept that students can really kind of take on as their own search into counter narratives, into omissions, into erasures. So yeah, here is our fabulous lineup, and it was hard to narrow it down to 8.
Hard to narrow it down.
So this was our 8 for this chapter. I'll go ahead, Dr. Lloyd-Washington, you start.
All right, so first up, if I would say is really, she's the original gangster of founding Black mothers would be Ona Judge Staines. And for us, it was really important that we not only denote them in our chapter as the names that they are found in the literature, but also their maiden names, the names that they were born with. Because what we were finding is there was even more information under these names. So she's Ona Judge Staines. And when we discussed her story, the title was A Dismissed Declaration. So what we know about Ona Judge is she was the physical property of Martha Washington, and then ultimately Martha and George Washington. And she absconded them as they were in the process of leading the nation during the founding of the nation. And she was actually one of their, I always call them, she escaped in the Fugitive Freedom, but she really was one of their pieces of property. That's how they, explained who she was, that actually was never caught. So we know Dunbar does a lot of research on Ona as a person, but really this idea of her never being caught is really a declaration that's dismissed from history. And as a young Black girl growing up, it would be really interesting for me to know and understand that Ona Judge Thames actually outsmarted the father of our nation. She was never caught. So next up is Mary Ann Shadd Cary. She was a lawyer, a teacher. She was the first Black woman to own a newspaper, period, point blank. I call her an intercontinental activist because she took her fight for freedom on international front. So she moved back and forth between Canada and the United States, educating Black children and really carrying on the concerns of the nation as it pertained to the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act. She was a staunch advocate for education and the education of Black children in her day, in her lifetime. She opened about 5 schools. That's what we have to count. We can point to those and find them in the archives, but I'm very sure that she blazed trails for other people to begin to educate Black children.
And so Mary Ellen Pleasant is next in the picture. Do you want me to do it that way, Dr. Lewis?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So Mary Ellen Pleasant, she really was, for me, the most interesting figure that we found in the archives. For me, she really kind of shows students that the struggle for freedom was ongoing and all mapped across the continent and across borders. So where she kind of began on the East Coast, up and down into Harper's Ferry in Virginia, and then kind of made her way to New Orleans, trained with Voodoo Priestess, and then made her way eventually to California, actually breaking many barriers. So streetcar kind of segregation in terms of running boarding houses. She was a millionaire. And actually, most folks don't know, bankrolled Harper's Ferry raid. So she actually has on her tombstone the epitaph she wishes that she actually had in real life, which is a friend of John Brown. So there's mystery, there's intrigue, there's travel. So for students, I was captivated by her story, and also the lack of real archives around her story. So really looking at kind of people who reenact and reenactors, and the scarce resources will provide students another kind of foundation for just how to dig, how to do the search. So Mary Ellen Pleasant is full of fantastic quotes and also really important kind of grounding around how the Underground Railroad was across the country, even into kind of the California during the gold rush. The next person, go ahead.
All right. Next person is someone that is discussed in the standards across the country, and as well as discussed in contemporary history around Black history. So we're looking at Arminta Ross, Harriet Moses Tubman. She has a lot of names. And I think we kind of unpack some of those unknown pieces of her story. So the ways in which she got the name Harriet Tubman, the ways in which I know the movie depicts her as having these prolific kind of religious spells, but really that was a result of being brutally beaten in the slave trade. In the ways in which we don't tell that story, but we've romanticized her life and kind of nuked it down to the Underground Railroad and really these like cinematic pieces of who she was. She was a general. She was an operative. She was the person that people looked to be able to change the face of slavery. She was that person. And oftentimes she is depicted by famous white men in text and in literature and in the archives as a man. So they actually, superimpose a male likeness on to Harriet Tubman. So our chapter kind of talks about the distortion of Harriet Tubman and really thinking about those aspects of her as a complex character in American democracy. She is more than moving people across state lines. She is more than the stories that are told about her. So really digging into who she was, her likeness and really the ways that she's talked about today. She is one of those individuals within American history whose story has not stopped.
Absolutely. The next person is Mary Richardson Bowser. So Mary Bowser is also really mysterious in terms of archives. There's a grave, but it was actually built or created after. And so there's a lot of really scant pieces and parts that we were putting together to find and follow her trail. Part of it is because she was a spy. So there's not a lot about her because she didn't want to be known. So we entitled hers Decoy in Disguise in the Belly of the Beast. So she actually was integral in being in Jefferson Davis's house, right? In the seat of the Confederacy, being an insurgent and coming out with some of the best information that really helped victory in the Civil War. So she also started schools. A lot of folks don't know that she also was a teacher. She worked in Freedman School. She started a school in Georgia, and then her trace disappears. So for students, she's very mysterious, very interesting. And there's a lot there about what we actually know about espionage and how to actually use stereotypes about enslaved women to her advantage to really actually bring victory in an integral war. So that is Mary Bowser.
Right. So another figure that we talk a lot about in books and literature that is more than a complex character in terms of how I was following her life, which is Isabella Bumfrey, and we know her as Sojourner Truth. We know that Sojourner Truth is the first Black woman to win a piece of court litigation against a white man for the return of her son after New York City actually abolished slavery as an institution, but not a practice. And that part of who she is not talked about as much as her literature writing and her advocacy for women's rights that she actually died not having. What's also interesting about her is this conversation around ableism and Black women in an ableism conversation. If you looked at the picture, that's one of the most contemporary pictures of her, they have her actually knitting, but we know that she was disabled in her left hand and couldn't move it. So how am I going to knit if I'm disabled? But they decoyed her to take, to really show, just this regular innocent, docile figure in history, but not really talking about her real likeness and story. And just like Mary Ellen Pleasant on her memorial tombstone, she asked America the question, is God dead? So even in her death, she was asking those critical questions of the country around the ways in which we were forming as a nation.
Actually, I think we have less than 5 minutes left. So I'm going to go ahead not talk about our two last founders. I'm going to go right to the piece of what we actually ended up creating in terms of application of how to teach this, how to caretake, how to be custodians, how to actually create a consciousness around abolition as you teach founding Black mothers. So I don't know, what, Candace, do you want to start? Or
yeah, I can start off. So this first conversation is, and it's something that we've been hearing about in contemporary teaching and learning, is this consciousness toward abolition. So really thinking about teaching and learning as a weapon against oppression. What ways do we use that last tenet of critical race theory and critical race theory in education to really empower our students to use education really as a weapon? We understand that schools are really the battleground for a full insurgency on the status quo. So what ways are we teaching, learning, and leading in schoolhouses and in universities for that consciousness towards abolition?
We also talk about the ways that that's really the foundation. You start there, right? So being a custodian, being a caretaker of founding Black mothers is not actually built on any foundation. It's built on very specific freedom-seeking frames. And so that's a non-negotiable, we decided, as talking about how how to be custodians, how to be caretakers. That really came kind of from guidance from Angela Davis and the ways in which caretaking can actually be a way to orient towards the work of teaching, learning, and actually teaching students. What would that look like to be the custodials or caretakers of legacies that we were never told, right? Why were we never told them? Why aren't we taught founding Black mothers in this way? And what would it be like for them to connect themselves and see themselves in the stories in this way? So I think we're kind of out of time. They said like 1 or 2 minutes left, but that's kind of it. I guess we can open for questions.
You all did a great job. Round of applause, everyone. Y'all did a really good job. So much there to unpack.
Yeah.
A lot of implications as well.
Absolutely.
Any questions?
I do wish we had gotten to hear the whole presentation, but that means I'll have to go read the chapter now, I think. So
Yes.
at least I have the information somewhere.
And just a shameless plug. We actually wrote for a grant through the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we won it. So we'll be holding an institute on founding Black mothers this summer.
Oh, well, maybe that's something you can share with our organization and we can
Absolutely
share out as well. It's
a shameless plug, but we would love to have.
We'll get that up on the website, on our calendar, and please let us know.
I was a little confused when you referred to archives. Are these specific archives you were looking at, or the archives like the alternative canon or something like that?
That's a good question. We actually, it's a
We
very
went
much like
everywhere.
the air quotes archives because,
Okay.
right, some of them
Yeah.
have more structured archives, like Marianne Shad-Carey has Howard University archives, whereas others, it's really a search and to try to create the archives. That's
create
a
the
great
archive.
question.
Yeah, it's a great question. We were everywhere, needless to say, to boil it down.
Thank you. An important addition.
Yeah, I really like
Thank
the
you.
way that you phrase this as restoration of knowledge. And again, like I wish we had heard the whole thing so that I would have a better understanding of it to make this comment. But I think, a lot of times when people are on social media, you'll see things that are like critical of critical race theory, or they're criticizing revisionist history. I think this idea of restoration of knowledge is a beautiful way to put that same idea, because it's not revisionist history. It's really picking up what is missing, right? And so this is just, I think, such a careful way to think about what we're actually doing. And I really appreciate that.
It's not a seat that we always talk about. It's not a seat at the table. It's actually opening up the whole table to make sure that we get a complete picture of our nation.
Thank you.